Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello and welcome to today's virtual Inform program at the Commonwealth Club. My name is Marisa Lagos. I am a correspondent for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk, and I co-host the Political Breakdown show and podcast. I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we get started, we would also like to thank the Club Psychology Forum for partnering on today's event. I'm really excited today to be joined by two leading advocates to discuss the recent legal and political challenges to abortion rights and the uncertainty that lies ahead. Alexis McGill-Johnson is president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the Planned Parenthood Action Fund. She's been Planned Parenthood leadership for more than a decade as PPFA board chair, Planned Parenthood federal PAC chair, and the Planned Parenthood Action Fund board member. Alexis, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Minnie Tamaraju is president of NARAL Pro-Choice America. She is a seasoned campaigner and organizational leader with over 20 years of experience leading federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacy efforts around reproductive rights, gender justice, and racial justice. So today we're going to talk about the tidal wave of anti-abortion bills that have been introduced in state legislatures. We're going to talk about what's ahead for Roe v. Wade, which will be decided by the Supreme Court probably later this year. And we want your questions on what is obviously a sensitive and often controversial topic. So if you're watching along with us, you can put them in the text chat on YouTube, and we'll be getting them to them later in the program. Welcome to both of you. Minnie, I didn't let you say hi. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off, I gave a little bit of your bios, but to talk a little bit about yourselves and how you came to this work. Alexis, I thought we'd start with you. You were a researcher by training. You co-founded an institute called the Perception Institute that uses science to help reduce racial bias and discrimination. So Planned Parenthood, like how did you come to this work?
I know, and and to be honest, I was a self-described race woman, right? Like I grew up understanding, living intersectionality, obviously, but really growing up in a household where race was a dominant frame through which we kind of understood our lives, our work, and so much of my research. And so it happened that one day I was walking down the street in New York City, and there was this billboard with this young Black girl's face on that I just, instinctively looked up to see, young Black girls don't often sell things. Let me see what I need to go buy. She's so cute. And I got closer to the billboard, and there were words underneath that said, the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. And it just stopped me dead in my tracks. I got so enraged about just the demonization of Black women and our reproductive choices. Damned if we do, damned if we don't. And I remember being at a dinner party with Cecile Richards, then president, and I went up to her and literally was like, do you know what's happening down in Soho? Do you understand what is at stake right now and Black women? And I just went on to this whole rant at her, and I said, you need to do something about it. And she said, no, you need to do something about it. And she recruited me to the board in a nomination process that was supported by none other than Minnie Tamaraju, who was my first point of contact into the organization. But literally, have stayed on the board and got I got to ride jump seat as Cecile's board chair and really understand just kind of what had been happening over the last decade, and was all in.
Awesome. Well, Minnie, your work has focused on the intersection of race and gender, but you've I talked about the political work, but you've also had corporate roles. You've worked for nonprofits. Why this issue specifically in NARAL now?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. So I'm a Planned Parenthood alum, and as Alexis said, I was working for Cecile, and part of my portfolio was managing the board when she became a board member. So it's really exciting and fun to be back in this role with her, being able to partner. I'm an immigrant kid. My parents immigrated from India to the United States in the early 70s. Really to pursue the traditional American dream. They thought hey, here's the land of opportunity. They were very progressive. I have a feminist throughout my generations of my life. My aunt ran a feminist press in India. My mother was my first role model. So we just assumed, she tells stories about she first came to this country and she saw Barbara Jordan on television and she was like, this is such a great country. Women can do anything. This is the best place in the world to raise my daughter. So we just assumed we were going to always have these rights. I grew up in Texas, so got an early taste at the intersection of race and gender personally. And that really did fuel my political fire. Went to college at UC Berkeley. I have to shout out Go Bears since I'm talking about the Common Club. And that definitely got me thinking about all the intersections and much more politically conscious. So I was always very active in gender justice, did a lot of work in the domestic violence movement early on in my career. But like Alexis, sometimes it just takes someone reaching out to you and saying, hey, there's a really cool opportunity. I was working for my local congressman. Somebody on the Planned Parenthood Houston board said, hey, there's a really cool opportunity for a leadership role with Planned Parenthood here in Texas, and crazy things are happening in the legislature. You'd be so good in this role. So I shifted gears and ended up working for Planned Parenthood for almost 4 years in the state level and the national level. But yeah, I joke that it's probably a bad joke my team doesn't want me to make, that I can't keep a job. I think a lot of us in politics, you kind of go back and forth. You work on a campaign, you go into government, you go into a nonprofit, you become an advocate. After Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 and I worked on that campaign, I was pretty lost, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Had some great friends in corporate America who were like, try this out. And I learned a lot. And it was really great perspective to bring back into NARAL as we're trying to think about future of work, really building sustainable long-term organization in a time when the movement's really fraught and under a lot of challenges. So I've been really blessed. I've had a lot of great opportunities.
Well, that's a great segue to my second question, which I would love each of you to kind of weigh in on why it's so important that you are both women of color doing this work, like the intersectionality between racism and reproductive rights, lack thereof. And we see this, not just because of data around that people of color constitute the majority of abortion procedures, but also that we saw this maternal health data out today, which is just devastating. So Alexis, let's go back to you. Like, why does it matter? Because y'all look different than the people that were helming Planned Parenthood and NARAL just a few years ago.
Yeah, it looks different and it feels different, I hope. This is a moment where, and consistently has been a place where women of color, people of color, seeking sexual and reproductive health care face different barriers, multiple barriers. And, at Perception, I talked a lot about, or did a lot of work on, a phenomena called intersectional invisibility, right? That most of us, from a gendered standpoint, from a binary standpoint, are seen through a lens of as a woman from outside. And yet the way in which, people of color are seen, it's through a prism of race first. And that impacts the ways in which they are treated throughout the healthcare system. And so to have representation at this level, people who understand both what the capacity and power of the work is, and also how it sits inside of a larger ecosystem that at its center has to serve women and partners and leaders of color. It just makes a really important, not just statement, but, an opportunity to really do significant work to undo, I think, white supremacy, to undo ways in which I think our movements have kept intersectional invisibility alive. And so I think it's really important for us in these moments to also be an accountability face, right? Someone who can hold the accountability with love and understand that it's not personal, but intended to move the organization and the movement in a direction that is going to really affirm the people who are most impacted right now.
Right. Well, and Minnie, on your work doing, advocacy, I would assume it's also important to pull people in at all levels of that, right? It's not just the leader of an organization, but making sure that this is not just a conversation that is happening among maybe more affluent or whiter people, but then is impacting people of color.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree. with everything Alexis said, and I'm a huge fan of her work at Perception Institute when she was there. What I'll say is to piggyback off of that, the majority of Planned Parenthood's clients, the majority of men and women and pregnant people in this country who are impacted by abortion bans, for example, and restricted access to comprehensive reproductive health care are people of color. So it's always been challenging that our movements were not necessarily led by people of color. And it's really hard to properly advocate for communities that you're not necessarily connected to. It's not impossible. A lot of wonderful people do it, but we could do better. I think what's a little scary in this moment is, there's so many incredible attacks which is the topic we're here to talk about, on abortion, that are disproportionately affecting marginalized communities, that have always disproportionately affected marginalized communities. And there's this moment where so many of our organizations are now being led by people of color. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we bring a critical perspective, that we can really live our values and demonstrate inclusion and equity, but we also can't magically transform legacy organizations that were helmed by white feminists for a very long time and that have potentially done historical damage, have also done really good work, but have also been fraught. So I think it's a journey. We're going to be doing a lot of collective work across our movements to really model inclusivity. But, we need partners to do that as well. We can't do it alone.
Yeah. I noticed that you talk about men and women, and I assume non-binary folk. I mean, talk about that framing, because it does seem like a lot of this conversation is just about the person who gets pregnant, which is obviously very important. We need to center that person, but does that language start you any?
So I'll say, one, I think when we talk about non-binary people, we talk about pregnant people, we're all getting better. Part of the inclusivity of the moment is to understand that not only women get pregnant, and we're in a new frontier of gender justice, younger people really leading the way and transforming the way we think and we do this work. And it's really exciting to me. And our movements are so interconnected. I think we saw today some really scary stuff happening in Texas, attacks on trans families. It's a perfect example of how all of our issues are interconnected, right? How we have to stand up for each other. But why are men important? Men get pregnant in their own way too. They're the other part of the equation in a heterosexual couple or even in a gay couple, right? And they have pregnancy justice issues too. They have reproductive health issues too. They are deeply affected by access to abortion bans, and younger men in particular are getting better and better about being advocates for the comprehensive care their families need. So we cannot really truly win gender justice without not male allies, but men understanding that they have skin in the game. They are literally, their families are affected. Right? They are personally affected. Their ability to have a future and a family are affected. So it's been wonderful to see men get more involved in issues like paid family leave, reproductive rights, and we need to see more of that.
Absolutely. All right, before we move on to all the news of the day, gosh, it's like a spreadsheet of all the bills and but Alexis, do you just want to give us a quick overview of how your two orgs work together? Planned Parenthood, right, provides vital health services to, I think, 2.5 million people around the country every year, 600 healthcare centers. Narrow Pro-Choice America is more of an advocacy group. So what are the roles that maybe are different, but how do you work together?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we are a provider, right? That is the majority of our work. It is the majority of it is exactly why we exist, and it is our mission. But the mission needs protection, and we have an action fund and a set of electoral arm that coordinates quite closely in strong partnership with NARAL, both in state and at the national level. And I think that, to Minnie's points around our organizations being really pivotal from having the ground game, right? From having the army of folks, the number of supporters who come to us specifically for this issue inside of the ecosystem, how important it is for us as drivers, particularly in this moment, to make sure that the engine is warm, that there's gas in it, and in partnership with our kind of states leaders as well as our reproductive justice colleagues, deciding where to deploy. But our action fund is in concert, really focused on accountability and ensuring that we are, doing everything we can to protect the mission.
Great. All right, well, let's get into it. As I said, there are dozens of states who have either passed or are considering laws. Many of them are sort of tying it to this Mississippi case and the potential for the Supreme Court to either overturn or severely undermine Roe v. Wade. So, Minnie, could we start with that? Like, why this case? What is there something specific about the way that law was written? Is there a strategy that was sort of undertaken to get this in front of this court, knowing that obviously we've watched as, it's become a more conservative court over the past few years?
Yeah, I think the strategy has been Roe is 49 years old. This is a 49-year strategy. There has been year after year of attacks at the state level, the national level, federal level on reproductive health. We've seen since Roe, we saw Planned Parenthood v. Casey. We've seen state legislation across the country that's already whittled away at the protections of Roe. Roe was always intended to be the floor, not the ceiling, but unfortunately it hasn't played out that way. So I think
Can you just explain exactly what Roe says? Because I think sometimes we gloss over that,
Yeah, I will say that, Roe gives us fundamental constitutional protection for the right to access abortion. Now, there's a lot, I will confess, I am not a constitutional scholar. I get a little tripped up, and Alexis, you can jump in and help me here if you care to, on the viability standard. But there is a lot of specific, it's a case that was decided based on privacy and on viability. Now, this case, and this is important, even though I caveated that I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Go for it.
Because the Mississippi case, our contention, and we're all in agreement on this, that there's no way for the court to uphold a 15-week ban on abortion and not gut or undercut or eliminate Roe because of the way Roe was decided. So we have a constitutional protection for access to abortion, but the way it was decided was always a little bit challenging, a little bit fraught. And I'll pause there and let my colleague.
I'll just jump in here
from the provider perspective.
Yeah, and on the pre-viability standard, right? So, so what Roe says is that any abortion pre-viability, right, meaning if a fetus can survive outside of the womb by itself, that is when a state has interest in stopping the procedure or being involved in that question. But anything pre-viability is the decision of the person who is pregnant. And so what is important, and we've seen this, over the last decade, right? We've seen 20-week bans, Mississippi personhood ban, right? We've seen 6-week bans. All of these have been struck down by the court system because they are clearly blatantly unconstitutional. And in this case, the fact that the court was willing to first take up a 15-week ban, right, and not just say it is unconstitutional, and even, and I know we'll dig deeper, listen to their oral arguments and ask these questions about whether or not it was correctly decided, because this is, obviously a federal protection is asserting its authority over states' rights, which is also another trope, which we should get into, becomes really important. But I think what the ultimate thing here is not ultimate, but another critical piece here, right, is that Roe is decided based on viability standards, based on privacy and the 14th Amendment, not on equality, right. Not on freedom, not on some of the core, issues which we think of when we actually talk about our freedom to decide or freedom to choose and so forth. And I think that's something that, we need to bring into conversation, particularly as we think about what it might look like to reconstruct Roe.
Yeah. So is this, Minnie mentioned that this is something, that folks who are anti-abortion have fought for since Roe was issued. But obviously the political, the court dynamics have changed in the last couple of years. Alexis, is it in your mind really about the makeup of the Supreme Court? Is there anything else going on here, either politically or sort of legally?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the intent to fight has been around for 49 years for sure, right? And there's been harassment of providers, shaming of patients, killing, murder, right, of providers as well. We've seen many different attacks on abortion over the last 49 years, but it really is in the last 10 years that we see a decade of, or going back to the 2010 Congress is kind of what I like to earmark it. we see a decade of power grabs, right? We see, a relentless pursuit after the 2010 Congress when they were able to gerrymander not only Congress, but also a number of state houses in the process. And then once in power, just weaponized rules changes, more gerrymandering, more court packing, till we get to a point where we have in so many of these states where every single state, there is a majority of support for accessing abortion. There literally is no state in the union that does not support access to abortion. And we know the national standards somewhere upwards of 80%. But in some of these states, we have a vocal minority, right? Really the tyranny of the minority, controlling the levers of power. And that's how we have seen the introduction of so many different bans over the last decade, in concert, obviously, with the last 4 years under the Trump administration, focusing relentlessly on court packing from, the federal judiciary, over 200 plus judges appointed all the way up through the 3 on the Supreme Court, cementing that majority. So it has been, it's like an animus towards a right does not in itself overturn a right. It really is about the structures and the systems that they have played in that have gotten us to the point where we are today.
Well, Minnie, though, how does that square then politically with what a lot of these folks' constituents want? Because, Alexis laid this out. I know there's always polling that shows some different numbers, but everything I've said does show that overall, Americans do support a right to choose, and that even in some of these more conservative states where maybe the numbers are closer, there's significant support. So what has been the public reaction in these places? Like, are you seeing pushback? Are there any warning signs for the people who are pushing these types of really draconian laws?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing a ton of pushback. I think there is a lot of sentiment right now, a lot of concern that the extremist legislatures in specific states like Mississippi, Texas, et cetera, have dramatically overplayed their hand. And they're taking a really big political risk. And they're doing it to pursue an ideological agenda that totally flies in the face of public opinion. 8 out of 10 Americans support a constitutional right to abortion. The challenge that we're facing, and Alexis laid it out brilliantly, is that there are a lot of issues, and I think folks in California probably grapple with this quite a bit, looking at the rest of the country. There's a lot of issues where the majority of Americans support the issue, but we can't make progress in Congress. We can't make progress in legislature. So voting rights, for example, gun violence prevention, LGBTQ plus civil rights and equality, the Equality Act, for example. Why is that? So we know that we're living in a moment where we are not in majority rule. We have lost a lot of our democracy. We've had a lot of erosion of democratic institutions. So it's really been critical for us to be thinking more broadly about protection of reproductive rights from a frame of democracy protection, because we're not able to move the ball the way we need to. Right. The extreme gerrymandering in some of these states has really resulted in situations where if there was a ballot initiative or a ballot measure or a statewide, for example, in Mississippi, I think it was 10 years ago that they struck down a personhood amendment. And now the legislature, the extreme gerrymandered legislature, passed this legislation to shut down the 15-week abortion ban. So how is that possible? Did the citizens of Mississippi become that much more conservative on reproductive rights? They did not. So we're not going directly to the people, right? Yeah. So I think it's just so important to understand that nuance.
Can I ask both of you to weigh in on how you advise people who do support pro-choice policies to talk to folks in their life that might be uncomfortable about this, right? Like, it is a much more personal, fraught sort of policy area than a lot of the other controversial ones you just mentioned, of course, and people's religious views play into this, their sort of philosophies. How do you sort of advise people, counsel them to have conversations with people that who might say, I would never have an abortion, but I'm open to abortion rights?
So, we have a very high profile president of the United States who's Catholic and supports abortion rights. It's right at the top. And his administration
speaker.
does too. Right, exactly. The Speaker of the House right there in San Francisco. The truth of the matter is, we first of all, we provide a lot of data information. The majority of Americans includes religious or groups, right? So we know the majority of Catholics, the majority of Muslims, the majority of Jewish people support reproductive rights. So it's really important to disabuse folks of stereotypes about what folks in their own community, friends, family, their constituents really think. Second, we've found we have lost some of the messaging war on some of these issues. It's important to talk about your fundamental freedoms. We find we've done a lot of research and collaborative work with Planned Parenthood. We just did a briefing for our friends at the DNC last week where he talked about this, where we like to refresh our friends in the party. A reproductive freedom frame has been much, much more effective in talking about our fundamental rights, our constitutional rights, than pro-choice, pro-life. That binary has become, frankly, so conflated, it's not really effective anymore. So when you talk about personal discomfort with abortion, that doesn't really square with my fundamental constitutional right, my freedom to decide my future, to plan my family. When you frame it as a fundamental freedom, most Americans completely agree with our position. So it's important to not get intimidated by the misinformation and a lot of the false narratives that are out there, to know the facts and the data, and to speak in the most broad terms about this as a freedom issue.
Yeah. Alexis, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And, first I might just challenge, I think sometimes what we see is this false equivalence that comes into the conversation around abortion rights, as if they're, they're kind of equal sides, when in fact it is a majoritarian mainstream issue, right? As I said, in every single state. So, which was not the case actually politically when Roe was decided, right? And so I think that it is important for us to actually name the progress that has come from people actually having freedom, the right to actually make these decisions over the last 49 years, even in spite of the fact that we have a long way to go in terms of ensuring access because of what has happened in so many of these states. And I do think that the freedom to decide, freedom from interference from the government, right? I mean, when I say regardless of how you feel about how you would, the choice that you would make, which, by the way, even saying that is stigmatizing for the people who have, you still don't want Joe Schmo lawmaker down the state house telling you what you can do with your own body. And I think that actually is a way to get to think about who are all the people that should be sitting in that exam room making a choice, right? And do you want your partner? Do you want it just to be you? Do you want to bring a friend? All of those things, no one is ever going to say, I want to bring a lawmaker into the room to help me make that decision. And I think that
even if they're married to one, they might not want.
Even if they're married to one, especially. Exactly.
Do you find that it's helpful? I was interviewing Dr. Michelle Goodwin this morning, along with another panel on this. And, she's really, I think, one of the people who has done a good job of framing this in our historical narrative around control over Black and brown bodies, around control over, gender. Do you find that those arguments are things that people help them put this into context, or do people shut down and oh, that's a bunch of academic jibbery jabbish?
I stan Michelle Goodwin. I mean, anything she's literally, I could put her on my Calm app and just have her read her law reviews to me to bed, because she's such a genius. And I think she's absolutely right that that we have to take into consideration history into these conversations, even as a movement, right? As a movement that also has to grapple with white supremacy in our space, and the work that we are doing to address it within our work. And so, and I think when we see things that come at us, right, oh my God, we're talking about what's happening in Texas around trans. We also have the GOP AGs who are clamoring over themselves to get rid of Griswold, right, to reassess, our right to contraception, because they thought it was wrongly decided, against states' rights. And so, these tropes that actually are rooted in race and history and structure, I think are really important for us to pay attention to. So, yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah, I always find in my job that giving people context, it can really, underscore how powerful some of this stuff is, because often we're looking at things within a very sort of immediate, framework. Well, let's get into a couple of these cases, and I am already getting some audience questions. So Minnie, let's start with one, which is how likely is it that Roe will be overturned, and what would be the immediate impact? We've kind of mentioned a lot of these states. There's obviously a smattering of different types of laws, but a lot of them would be triggered by an overturning or weakening of Roe, correct?
Yes. So I think we're tracking 29 states that have some sort of abortion ban, either in their legislature, a trigger ban already in place. They're working on an SB 8 copycat bill. That's the draconian bounty hunting, extremist, crazy bill in Texas. Florida's trying to push one through. So 29 states, the majority of the country, would immediately be poised to ban abortion. To your first part of your question, we fundamentally believe there's no way for the court to uphold the 15-week abortion ban in Mississippi and not overturn Roe. It's really important, like I'll repeat it, we believe strongly this court is poised, based on the oral arguments we heard, to uphold this ban and to gut Roe. Now, this is important. They may not say, we hereby overturn Roe v. Wade. They likely won't do that. And that will leave some room for interpretation within many parts of our political discourse, but it will unequivocally be clear that Roe, for providers and for advocates, that Roe will be overturned.
And Alexis, another question is what recourse there could be, given the possibility Roe could be overturned. Is there a plan to create a different protection of women's right to abortion? I assume this person means federally. And one thing I've, thought about is like medical abortions or medication abortions, excuse me. Like, is there any federal policy, understanding that can be complicated as well with this Congress, but like, is there any recourse in that way?
Well, actually, this week we got an app for that one, right? Exactly. It's called the Women's Health Protection Act, and the Senate is due to vote on it on February 28th. Okay. They just moved it out of the cloture vote on last week. So members are in district right now having conversations with their constituents about why it is so important to support the Women's Health Protection Act. What would the Women's Health Protection Act do? It would actually prevent a Florida law, like a 15-week ban, from going into effect, some of these copycat laws from Mississippi, because it would establish a federal protection to Roe and to, particularly on these on some of these regulations that undermine the viability standards. So that is actually something that we would love to see more people engaging with their lawmakers, their senators in particular, because that is legislation that could move forward and actually help us in this moment. We also know that, we know to Minnie's point, that a lot of people are waiting for the decision, right? We've got Texas, the 6-week ban with the bounty hunter provision, and we've got this 15-week ban and these copycat bans that we are seeing across the country. A lot of them are coming into play, waiting for the SCOTUS decision to come down. And there are about, I think, 12 states that have trigger laws, right? That are already where banning abortion is already in their constitution. So they would essentially, be triggered through a process to stop providing in those states. And then a number of other states are already looking at things within their constitutions. Like Kansas, right, to take away the right that's enshrined in the Constitution. There's a ballot initiative to do that work. There are also proactive ballot initiatives, like in Michigan, to get versions of protecting Roe in their state constitutions. There are states like New Jersey and California that have put in, New York, like reproductive freedom acts in various ways that ensure that Roe will be, codified, or access to abortion will be there. So there are all kinds of ways in which, from a legislative standpoint, states are taking action. And to your point, the Biden administration has lifted the restrictions on medication abortion. It used to be that you could not access medication abortion through telemedicine, so through telehealth in many states. They've lifted these restrictions, as you can imagine, many of the same states that have the same bans also have restrictions on accessing telemedication abortion. But the reality is people, what none of these restrictions have done is stop people from seeking abortion. It stopped people from seeking medication abortion, and it's just made it harder. So the work from a provider standpoint is to really think through how the best way to help people gain access and do so early with medication as possible.
Is that something that the federal government could say overrule states on? Like, is that if they're passing laws to ban that or to require, I know some have tried to get around it with like, oh, you have to have an in-person visit or there's other restrictions. Is that a legal pathway?
That is in part why we need WIPA. That underscores, WIPA would help.
This is the bill she's talking about?
And just to make sure Californians know, both your senators are co-sponsors of WIPA, so thank them, please, for us, and we will as well. But that is why we need legislation. I think the question about what the White House can do and what the administration can do, there's limitations with what they can do without Congress. And
of course, it could be overturned by whoever's in there next.
Yes. Yeah. As could WIPA. That's why the next piece of it is elections. We have to grow our Senate majority. We have to hold on to the House, and we have to mobilize around the outcome of this case to really draw the stark connection for voters that everything's on the line, and we need a larger majority in the Senate to get some of these things done, including democracy reform.
Well, there's the politics of it as a political reporter always interests me. And I noticed, researching for this, that there are a slew of these 15-week bans that are sort of mirroring the Mississippi law. And I'm just curious why you think they're going that route instead of maybe banning abortion entirely through a trigger law or things like that. Like, do you think that is a political or a legal calculation? Or is it just like, easy to sort of copy and paste the legal text and go through it that way?
Clear, the end game is to end abortion. Like we shouldn't be, right? So, but it is a way, it's a test, right? A threshold test to unravel Roe. So if they are able to get, basically put some parameters around the pre-viability standard, right? 2 weeks is still not viable. And they're able to, to get traction there. We have no doubt they will then move to the 6-week ban, or then they will move to the 4-week ban, right?
Right. But I like looking at a place like Arizona, like they already have a law that would automatically ban abortions if Roe v. Wade was overturned. So then why on top of that past the 15 weeks? Do you think it's in case they don't fully gut it? Is it like, what's the strategy?
Planning. It's scenario planning for the. Yeah.
Interesting. And then I also noticed that some of these states sort of have, I don't know what the word is, but like in Florida, they ultimately, or I think one house already passed a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. There was a separate one that would have sort of mirrored SB 8 in Texas, the 6-week ban. Is that do you think, responding to the politics we've discussed, that there's like a concern that some of these, even if the ultimate goal, as Alexa says, is to ban it entirely, appear to be too extreme?
Yes. I think our opposition is unfortunately has developed some pretty savvy tactics. And frankly, they lead with just basically lying and extreme disinformation and misinformation about abortion. Susan B. Anthony List, the right-wing super PAC, has been pushing out ads talking about how 15 weeks is viable and how it's and co-opting medical terminology and talking about how this is the European standard and science has advanced, and there's a lot of crazy stuff out there. And there's a direct line between those efforts to normalize and moderate their extremist positions and this range of legislation you're seeing pop up in the states, right?
And at the same time, a lot of them have no rape or incest carve-outs, things like that. I mean, though, that always struck me as part of the sort of messaging, it was like, oh, well, no choice. But in these cases, like, how do you square that, Alexis?
Again, because how do you square crazy, right? The end game is to is to end abortion, like full stop. There is no, and every single, effort, whether they are mandating transvaginal ultrasounds, whether they are shaming patients and providers, whether they're insurance coverage bans, trap laws, waiting periods, all of these things are designed exactly. I mean, to end access to abortion, and so the reality is there's no need to. I mean, you don't need to square it, right? Because you understand what the end game is.
This goes to a question you asked earlier, Marisa, which was, why this law? Why not? I mean, they've been really great about throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. They try, and we need to have the freedom to do that too as a movement, as a progressive, reproductive rights movement. We have to try every tactic and every strategy. They've been really just audacious about trying every kind of bananas ban and to see which one the court would take up and which one would stick. And so I think that's why you're seeing such a range and such diversity. But I would encourage the political press. I think your line of questioning is great. It's not for us, it's for them. They need to be scrutinized. No, but seriously, like, not to be defensive, but they need to be scrutinized about this, right? They need to be scrutinized about why they think that they are that they're messaging that they are pro women, and yet anti-exceptions for rape and incest. Why these changes? Why on one hand are they positioning their messaging as if they are evolved or evolving as a movement? At the same time, they're getting more barbaric in their tactics. These are good questions.
Well, they're looking at the same polls. I want to ask you all to respond, not square or explain, but to one sort of line of questioning that Justice Coney Barrett brought up, which is like this idea of throwing out adoption as an option. And there's this, I mean, hearing a Supreme Court justice say that was, I think, really, it was surprising to me to hear that. I mean, how do you push back? Like what, like, and explain, I mean, you're both shaking your head. I know why, but explain why. Like, it seems, it's pretty, yeah. I'll let you characterize it, Minnie.
So I'm partially shaking. There's a personal reaction I'm having to it, and there's a professional. I mean, professionally, like, first of all, this goes back to the commodification of women's bodies and white supremacy. I mean, how dare she talk about women as carriers? I mean, that's essentially what she was doing. Women can just carry these babies to term and then place them for adoption. And it's 100% like Stone Age commodification of women's bodies, particularly Black and brown women's bodies. It's outrageous. And folks should have been just disgusted. I myself am an adoptive parent, and I'm an advocate for reproductive freedom. So for me personally, it physically made me sick to think about. That someone would imply I would have that kind of disrespect for my children's birth, original family, their birth mother. Incredible. So I think, look, that's why, by the way, we are pretty convinced they're going to uphold the Mississippi ban, because the kind of stuff that was said in these oral arguments was so over the top, outrageous and offensive, and then taken as just, well, this is the new court. This is their philosophy. And there was, analysis done. I mean, frankly, anyway, it makes me a little irrational. Sorry, I'll stop there.
I don't think you are irrational at all. But yeah, Alexa.
It gets me very emotional.
And it's also interesting, right? Because you look at these, plus one on everything that Minnie said. And then you also look at the state of well-being and care for kids. Let's just take Texas and Mississippi, right? The number of kids that are in foster care, the number of kids that are poverty. Exactly. So it just, it doesn't comport with the reality of how people live and to be so out of touch, right? To be so misogynistic about how we decide to use our bodies, and to kind of equate like forced pregnancy as a means to, you only have to be forced to be pregnant, but you don't actually have to hold the responsibility, feels, it just was quite jarring. I don't, there's not a word to put with it.
The other point
you bring up another,
you brought it up earlier, the maternal morbidity and mortality rates in Mississippi, for example. I mean, outrageous. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's pregnant. So this is why when we were talking about Roe being the floor and the ceiling and privacy and viability versus equality and like equal rights, this is why there needs to be a whole fundamental reframing for why this should be our constitutional right. We should have control over our bodies because it's our right to life. It's our right to live. It's incredibly dangerous for a woman to be pregnant. It's much more safer for her to have an abortion. That's the medical reality of the moment we're in.
That's right.
Well, you guys brought up another sort of maybe obvious question. Maybe it's a little bit of it, but which is, are we seeing any of these states, while they pass these laws, expand programs to support pregnant women and families, to support children once they are born, to even support adoption acts? Is that, you guys are like, no.
We can't even get paid family leave.
I know, exactly. Exactly.
I mean, it's crazy. There's not one Republican that supports paid family leave. But we want to push pregnant people into forced birth. But yeah, the quick answer is no. We're not seeing that.
Yeah, exactly. No rash. No.
The states sometimes I just have to ask the question.
The states that are expanding access, like California, are the states that are also investing in childcare, paid leave, pay equity, all these things that make lives better.
So we have another audience question, which is, what proactive strategies beyond defending Roe should we be pursuing? It's an audience question on it.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, so we talked about WIPA, which we think is critically important this week, that folks could be doing or calling people in key states where we could see where we need some increased support for WIPA. There is the work to support telemedicine and telemab. In terms of softening those restrictions by state. This is very much state-based work. There is obviously a lot of work that needs to happen direct to patient support in this particular moment, as people are, the reality is people are getting in their cars. They need gas money. They are driving, thousands of miles to clinics out of state. They may need childcare. They may need, some place to stay. So abortion funds are incredibly important. They also need to pay for the procedure. Ensuring that organizations on the ground that are helping patients navigate and also wayfind their way into other states is critically important. I guess the last thing I would just say is that there is a very real believability gap that is out there. So we talked about 80% of people supporting access to abortion. In a recent poll, only 33% of people believe that Roe was actually going to be overturned. And so, the sky is falling, and having people engage publicly and mobilize because it is falling, and helping them close the gap, that the reality is we are 6 months into Texas's 6-week ban. And that has essentially rendered abortion meaningless in this state, right? We know that abortions have dropped 60% the second month in Texas. And so, really thinking a lot and getting proximate to who is being impacted, because that will, sit with you and create, there's no kind of action without the urgency, and getting that, I think, is really important.
Vinny, I'd love you to jump in, and also, having just been in Texas, if you want to talk a little bit more about
I was
what is the reality.
I want to underscore what Alexis said. We don't have to wait for the court to decide the Mississippi case. Roe has already been rendered meaningless. And the fact that SB 8 was allowed to stand by this Supreme Court when they had an opportunity to strike it and they did not, tells you everything you need to know. So I was just in Texas doing some campaign work. I think I'm allowed to talk about it, right? For the basically a young Latina immigrant candidate running against Jessica Cisneros. She's amazing. She's running against Henry Cuellar, the last anti-choice Democrat left in the U.S. House of Representatives, completely out of touch with his party, with his constituents, with his state. He actually voted against WIPA right in the aftermath of SB 8 in his own state. And he represents a part of South Texas that is incredibly, incredibly fraught and damaged by SB 8. So it's really shocking. But I was just on the ground. I'm a Texan. It's terrifying what's going on. on the ground in Texas. Just because abortion rates have dropped in Texas doesn't mean those women aren't trying to get out of the state to have abortions. They're getting to Oklahoma, they're going to Mexico, they're going all the way to California. So look, I think we have to be drawing more public outrage to all of Alexis's points, and we have to have consequences at the ballot box. If we don't this November, the believability gap challenge will be even starker. Like, we have to do our job is to make sure that all Americans understand what's at stake between June, July, when the court reaches its decision, and the November election.
I mean, is that a sort of tragic opportunity in the sense of when you talk about the lack of awareness? I think a lot of people in my role of pundit hats are like sort of debating whether this could have a really big impact on the midterms.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the reality is it is very likely, and Minnie and I talk about this, that we're presiding over organizations during the fall of Roe, and what does that mean to actually lose a right that we have fought for, right? And I think it's it's happened, like during Reconstruction. There are times when our rights have been taken away from us. But we also have to think about, what does that reconstruction and reimagination look like? Yes. And that is in the ways in which we've been very intentional about centering the work that we have to do around race equity, to ensure that the people who are most impacted are at the table and resourced and driving different conversations is a piece of that work, right? It's an opportunity for us to reimagine the movement in a way that is multi-generational, that is multiracial and ethnic, and inclusive in a way that is going to really build more power to fight back in all of these states. And so I think that is actually the opportunity that we have to hold from hold in the future, and to be prepared to capture the rage in June and carry that rage through the fall and into the midterms, where we will see accountability. And I think this is like the untold story from the 2017, 2016, obviously we had our last president, 2017. People were out in the streets marching like never before. 2018, we ushered in the first pro-choice Congress. 2019, we won governor's races, state houses, and in Kentucky and Virginia, and there's an ebb and flow, but the arc is still moving towards staying grounded and kind of where support for this issue. So I think we can kind of sit in the darkness right now, and really focus our energy on making sure that people have what they need to get care, making sure that we are channeling the rage and showing who is responsible for getting us here and holding them accountable in the fall. I think all of those things have to happen.
I think your tragic opportunity was beautifully said. I may steal it or borrow it with your permission. None of us ever wished for this to happen. That's why we're fighting so hard for WIPA. That's why we're fighting so hard to codify Roe in state constitutions and state legislatures across the country. But again, Roe was always supposed to be the floor. And we wanted the opportunity to re-envision true gender equality, gender equity, or reproductive health equity in a different way. So this gives us that chance. It's not a chance we wish to have happen this way, but it will be, I think, a very rude awakening for the majority of Americans. And again, it's our job, it's our responsibility to really take advantage of the moment, and make sure this can't happen again. I worked for Hillary in 2016. What's just shocking and remarkable to me is in one administration, in 4 years, that president, I won't say his name today, was able to enshrine a supermajority of extremists on the court. When folks on our side say, oh, it's not all about the court, or you guys are being too hysterical, I don't know if we were being hysterical enough. Like, let's be candid. Everything we predicted came true, but worse in one administration, one short 4 years. So if that doesn't underscore how devastating the consequences are of elections, I don't know what will.
Yeah. I'm curious, I mean, as you track what's happening in a lot of these more conservative states, we see places like California, who put together a whole future of abortion council. I think you mentioned New York. Like, how important is that? Because this is a huge country, right? And if you are a young woman in the Midwest, California's, New York are very far away, but is it about the actual access that other states can provide, or is it as much about the organizing you're talking about?
It's about both, to be honest. I mean, California and New York will definitely see, people incoming, right? They already are from just from Texas alone, right? Because we're seeing Texas, you go to New Mexico, Texas patients go to New Mexico, and those New Mexican patients are going to Arizona, going to California, and they're making their way there. So it is really important to have work like the Future of Abortion Council in California happening. But California and New York's like best export right now is imagination, right? It is about helping us understand what access, truly meaningful access, looks like. So when Minnie's talking about the ceiling, what does the rose ceiling look like? California has an opportunity to actually dream the ceiling and show what it looks like, not only to have access, but to have that access funded by the state, because it's essentially, it's normalizing the fact that abortion is healthcare. So that is the true power, I think, of what's happening right now in California.
Yeah.
Plus one to everything Alexis said. And then I'll add that the majority of Americans live in these urban centers. So the fact that we have folks like, the governor of California really pushing the envelope and doing big, bold things 100% will help us reimagine a future, a true reproductive equity future. But it also is a great template and model for mayors of big cities in some of these tougher purple states, in some of these red states, to really push the envelope. It's a collaboration. It's an opportunity to really grow and expand the footprint of the work we could be doing together. So it's so important.
Yeah. As you spoke, Alexis, one thing that struck me is I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit about reproductive rights in general and like access to healthcare within this framework, because I think we focus so much on this for obvious reasons, but it's really part of a constellation that clinics like Planned Parenthood provide in terms of support for families and women, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, you just look at the last 2 years of COVID, right, to understand how important sexual and reproductive healthcare and healthcare is, how vulnerable healthcare is from an infrastructure standpoint, right? If like Planned Parenthood sits as part of a public healthcare, infrastructure network, and what we saw during the early days of COVID were patients whose bodies were largely being deemed essential workers who, I would see every morning getting on, the A train, to go down and open up the hospitals, be on the night shift for the nursing homes, what have you, but being those bodies that were keeping the bare minimum of what we could have open. And we were literally naming that their bodies were essential. And in state after state where they were doing that, and those bodies largely Black and brown, they were being told that they couldn't do things with their bodies, right? And so, when you think about healthcare broadly and the barriers to accessing care, your ability to pay, your ability to argue with your insurance company as to whether or not they're going to pay, right? Like that's an actual luxury. When you're talking about the transportation, you're talking about all the ways in which the bias operates in discrimination in healthcare systems. We're looking at this 20% increase in the maternal mortality rate as evidence of that. That is just having the right to access healthcare broadly does not actually help you access it. So thinking about, for Planned Parenthood, we do everything through the lens of our patients. And so, yes, we're fighting for access to sexual and reproductive health care, including abortion, but we also need in community to make sure that they have access to the things that they need in order to get there, right? And we know that they may come to us for things like, birth control or an STI testing or an abortion, and they may leave and be experiencing other kinds of indignities. And so it's important to stand in all kinds of ways around this barrier to care.
Before we get to our last question, Minnie, I would love if you could just sort of underscore something we opened with, which is who an overturning of Roe would disproportionately impact. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about sort of just the demographics of,
Mhm.
who's able to travel versus who, would not
Yeah,
be.
it's all of our traditionally underserved communities, predominantly people of color, but it's also folks in rural areas who already had limited access. We have it's LGBTQ plus communities, folks who do not have confidence in the healthcare system, don't have health insurance, don't have the ability to access care as it is because of the pandemic, who may not be in a traditional insurance coverage model. So there's a whole host of communities that are going to be disproportionately affected, but it's the traditional underserved communities that were already fraught in terms of their access to healthcare that will be devastated first. People
and I assume younger people.
Yes,
Yeah.
and well, younger people. Although I think the most common, this is a fact I learned when I worked for Planned Parenthood, the most common, I think, stage of life for abortion actually is when a family already has one or two children. So it's actually a lot of, pregnant people in their 30s. So it's not, the teen mom stereotype.
Right.
And that's important to
Absolutely.
understand too.
All right, you've both been wonderful. We are going to end with an informed tradition, which is to ask our speakers, what is your 60-second idea to change the world? No pressure after an hour of deep thoughts. Alexis.
I'm going to shout out some Bay Area folks that we have been working with, Aorta, amazing group of leaders on what it means to actually adopt a Black feminist praxis, my leadership team, and thinking about how are we going to transform the organization and the work in order to meet this particular, need for our patients, but also inside of the movement, given, many described who is impacted. My 60-second, view would be to, if all government and corporate leaders went through the same praxis and framework, and they were able to actually think about how to build systems and structures around those who have experienced the most marginalization and resource them in ways that we, many other communities may take for granted. We could build a very intentional, expansive and inclusive super democracy, a super majority of ways to be. And it would be one of abundance and joy.
Perfect. Minnie, your thoughts?
I was going to say something similar. When I was in the administration, we had this massive government-wide race equity project where we applied a race equity lens to every aspect of our government work. And it was really transformative for a lot of us. I mean, I've done race equity work in pieces throughout my career, but not in this way, but it's very similar to what Alexis is talking about. So I'll add applying that same kind of lens to our political work. Earlier this year, some of our groups collectively decided to, change our endorsement policy around voting rights and fill the filibuster. I think we need to be more, I would love to see us. This is a path that was started by my predecessor at NARAL, so I can't take credit for it. But I think collectively, as progressive organizations, we need to be much more intersectional in our organizing. So we need to be more thoughtful about, what is reproductive, what does reproductive freedom, hinge on. And as I said before, it's really erosion of democratic institutions has been the challenge for us, and really pushing through policies that the majority of Americans support. So I would love to see a lot of us doing a lot more work around civil rights, voting rights, not putting it in a box saying, well, this is voting rights, and this is repro, and this is climate justice, and this is this. We should be fundamentally examining threats to our democracy and collectively working together in partnership. And that's beginning to happen. And I think that can also be done in a joyful and abundant way. We should have an abundance mentality as we're doing this work too, and not be competing for resources.
Absolutely.
Thank you for ending on a positive note. It's always nice to give people a little bit of hope. So much thanks to Alexis McGill-Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, and Minnie Tamaraju, President of NARAL Pro-Choice America. And thanks to our audience for joining us today. If you want to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making in-person and virtual programming possible, you can go to commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Marisa Lagos from KQED. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.